August 20th, 1989, Beverly Hills, California. A 911 call came in at 11:47 p.m. Two young men, hysterical, screaming, barely coherent. "Someone killed my parents." Beverly Hills Police Department dispatched units immediately. The address given was 722 North Elm Drive, a mansion in one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in Beverly Hills. The kind of place where violent crime simply didn't happen. Officers arrived within minutes. They found two young men outside the house. Brothers. Erik Menendez, 18 years old. Lyle Menendez, 21 years old. Both were crying, shaking, appeared to be in complete shock. Before we dive in, if you're interested in cases where the truth is more complex than it first appears, please like, share, subscribe, and turn on notifications. This channel examines the full story, not just the surface. "They're inside," Erik managed to say between sobs. "In the den. I think they're dead." Officers entered the house carefully. It was massive, expensive furniture, art on the walls, the kind of wealth most people can't even imagine. They found the den, and what they saw inside was a massacre. Two bodies, a man and a woman. Jose Menendez, 45 years old. Kitty Menendez, 47 years old. Shot multiple times. The scene was brutal, violent, blood everywhere. Jose was sitting on the couch. He'd been shot in the back of the head, point blank, then shot multiple times in the arms and legs. The couch and walls behind him were splattered with blood and brain matter. Kitty was on the floor near the couch. She'd been shot in the face, in the chest, in the arms. She tried to crawl away. You could see the blood trail. She'd been trying to escape when the shooter came back and finished her off with a shot to the face. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This wasn't a random home invasion. This was execution. This was rage. This was personal. The brothers were brought inside, asked if they could identify the victims. Both broke down completely when they saw their parents' bodies. Erik collapsed, had to be helped outside. Lyle kept saying no, no, no over and over. Detectives arrived, started processing the scene, started interviewing the brothers. Erik and Lyle said they'd been out that evening, went to see a movie, Batman, at the Century City Mall. Got back home around 11:30 p.m., found the front door open, walked in and found their parents dead in the den. They said they didn't hear any shots, didn't see anyone leaving, didn't know who could have done this. Detectives asked about enemies, about anyone who might want to hurt Jose or Kitty. The brothers said their father was a successful entertainment executive. He'd worked his way up from nothing, immigrated from Cuba as a teenager, built a career in the entertainment industry, eventually became CEO of Live Entertainment, a major video distribution company. Jose was powerful, wealthy, made a lot of money, but that also meant he probably had enemies, business rivals, people he'd stepped on climbing to the top, people who might hold grudges. Kitty had been a homemaker, focused on raising the boys, no obvious enemies. Everyone described her as a devoted mother, maybe too devoted. Some said she was controlling, but not someone who'd inspire murder. The crime scene told a story. Multiple shotgun blasts. The killers had come prepared, had reloaded at least once. This wasn't impulsive. This was planned. Detectives looked for signs of forced entry. None. The front door had been unlocked when the brothers arrived, but there was no evidence it had been broken or forced open. Nothing appeared to be stolen. Jose's Rolex was still on his wrist. Kitty's jewelry was untouched. Expensive electronics throughout the house, all still there. This wasn't about robbery. This was about killing Jose and Kitty Menendez. The investigation began immediately. Detectives interviewed neighbors. Nobody heard shots. Nobody saw anyone suspicious. The mansion was somewhat isolated, set back from the street, surrounded by trees and walls. Detectives looked into Jose's business dealings, into his professional life. He was a demanding boss, aggressive. Some people described him as ruthless. But was he ruthless enough that someone would murder him and his wife in their own home? They investigated potential mob connections. Jose's company distributed videos. That industry had some shady elements. Maybe Jose had gotten involved with the wrong people. Maybe this was a mob hit. But mob hits don't usually look like this. Mob hits are efficient. One shot. Quick. Clean. This was overkill. This was emotional. Detectives kept coming back to the brutality. The number of shots. The way Kitty had been shot while trying to crawl away. Someone really wanted these people dead. Someone really hated them. In the days after the murders, Erik and Lyle were devastated. They made funeral arrangements, buried their parents, accepted condolences from friends and family. Everyone felt terrible for them. Two young men who'd lost both parents in such a horrific way. Their whole lives destroyed in one night. But as the investigation continued, detectives started noticing things. Small things. Things that didn't quite add up. The brothers' behavior after the murders was unusual. Within weeks, they were spending money. Lots of money. Erik bought a Porsche. $60,000. Lyle bought a Rolex. Multiple Rolex watches, actually. They took trips. Stayed in expensive hotels. Ate at fancy restaurants. Their parents had been wealthy. The estate was worth about $14 million. The brothers were the beneficiaries. So technically, it was their money now. But the speed at which they started spending raised eyebrows. Most people who just lost their parents would be grieving, not shopping. Lyle moved out of the family mansion and into a high-rise apartment in Marina del Rey. Furnished it with expensive furniture. Threw parties. Acted like he didn't have a care in the world. Erik hired a full-time tennis coach. He'd been a promising tennis player in high school. Now he was training intensively, traveling to tournaments, spending thousands on equipment and coaching. In the first 6 months after their parents' deaths, the brothers spent close to $1 million. Detectives watched all of this, and they wondered, what kind of sons lose their parents to murder and immediately start living like they won the lottery? The investigation into outside suspects wasn't going anywhere. No mob connections. No business enemies with clear motives. No evidence of anyone else entering or leaving the house that night. Detectives started looking more closely at Erik and Lyle, at their relationship with their parents, at what life was really like inside that Beverly Hills mansion. What they discovered would change everything about this case. As detectives dug deeper into the Menendez family, a picture began to emerge. And it wasn't the perfect family image that had been presented to the public. Jose Menendez was a demanding father, extremely demanding. He pushed his sons constantly, wanted them to be successful, to be winners, to be the best at everything. Lyle had gone to Princeton University, but he'd been suspended for plagiarism during his freshman year. Jose was furious, saw it as a failure, a disgrace to the family name. Erik was a talented tennis player, but not quite talented enough to go pro. Jose pushed him harder, made him practice for hours, berated him when he lost matches. Friends of the brothers described Jose as controlling, perfectionist, never satisfied with anything less than excellence. Kitty was described as emotionally fragile, dependent on prescription medication, drinking heavily at times, struggling with depression. But from the outside, they looked like the perfect Beverly Hills family. Wealthy, successful, living the American dream. After the murders, that facade started to crack. Erik and Lyle weren't just spending money. They were living completely different lives than they had before. Lyle became more confident, more outgoing, started dating, started enjoying life in ways he never had when his parents were alive. Erik seemed more relaxed, less anxious. The intense pressure he'd been under his whole life suddenly lifted. Their behavior suggested relief more than grief, and detectives noticed. But having a motive isn't the same as having evidence. Detectives needed proof. They needed something concrete that connected Erik and Lyle to the actual murders. The break in the case came from an unexpected source. Erik Menendez had a therapist, Dr. Jerome Oziel. Erik had been seeing him for some time, working through various issues. In October 1989, 2 months after the murders, Erik went to see Dr. Oziel. And during that session, Erik broke down, started talking about the murders, started confessing. Dr. Oziel recorded some of his sessions. It was his practice to document particularly significant conversations. And this was definitely significant. Erik confessed that he and Lyle had killed their parents, told Dr. Oziel the whole story, how they'd planned it, how they'd bought shotguns, how they'd carried it out. According to Erik's confession, they'd been afraid. Afraid their parents were going to kill them first. Afraid because of things that had happened in the family. Things Erik wasn't ready to talk about in detail yet. Dr. Oziel was in a difficult position. Patient confidentiality is sacred in therapy, but there are exceptions. If a patient poses a danger to themselves or others, a therapist can break confidentiality. Dr. Oziel wasn't sure what to do. Erik had confessed to a past crime, not a future one. Were the brothers still dangerous? Would they hurt someone else? Lyle found out that Erik had been talking to Dr. Oziel. He showed up at the therapist's office, confronted him. According to Dr. Oziel, Lyle threatened him, told him to keep quiet about what Erik had said. Dr. Oziel secretly recorded this confrontation with Lyle. Now he had both brothers on tape. One confessing, one threatening. Dr. Oziel told his mistress, Judalon Smith, about the tapes, about what Erik and Lyle had done. She was sworn to secrecy, but the burden of that secret was heavy. Meanwhile, detectives continued their investigation. They still didn't have enough to arrest the brothers. No physical evidence, no witnesses, just suspicions about their behavior and spending. Then, in March 1990, 7 months after the murders, Judalon Smith went to the police. She told them about Dr. Oziel's tapes, about Erik's confession, about Lyle's threats. She said she couldn't keep the secret anymore, couldn't live with knowing that 2 murderers were walking free. Police obtained a warrant for Dr. Oziel's tapes. The issue of doctor-patient confidentiality went to court. Eventually, a judge ruled that because Lyle had threatened Dr. Oziel, the tapes could be used as evidence. On March 8, 1990, Erik and Lyle Menendez were arrested. Erik was in Los Angeles. Lyle was playing tennis at a country club in Beverly Hills. They were both charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. Special circumstances. That meant if convicted, they could face the death penalty. The arrests shocked the community. These weren't hardened criminals. These were privileged young men from Beverly Hills. College-educated, well-spoken. They didn't fit the profile of cold-blooded killers. But the evidence against them was strong. The confession tapes, the spending spree, the lack of any other suspects, the brothers' own behavior. As they awaited trial, the brothers began working with their defense attorneys. And that's when the real story started to come out. Erik and Lyle claimed they'd killed their parents in self-defense. Claimed they'd been abused their entire lives. Physically, emotionally, and sexually abused by their father. Enabled by their mother who knew what was happening and did nothing to stop it. They said they lived in fear. That Jose had threatened to kill them if they ever told anyone about the abuse. That on the night of the murders, they believed their parents were going to kill them first. So they killed Jose and Kitty to save their own lives. This changed everything. Suddenly, this wasn't just a case about 2 greedy sons killing their parents for money. This was potentially a case about abuse victims fighting back against their abusers. But was it true? Had Jose and Kitty really abused their sons? Or was this just a convenient defense strategy to avoid the death penalty? The prosecution believed it was a lie. A story made up by defense attorneys to generate sympathy, to turn murderers into victims. The defense insisted it was the truth. That years of abuse had created a situation where Erik and Lyle genuinely feared for their lives. That killing their parents was the only way to escape. The stage was set for what would become one of the most controversial trials of the 1990s. If you believe in understanding the full truth behind complex cases, please like, share, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Sometimes the story is deeper than headlines suggest. The first Menendez trial began in July 1993, almost 4 years after the murders. The case had generated massive media attention. Court TV broadcast the entire trial live. Millions of people watched. Everyone had an opinion. The prosecution's case was straightforward. Erik and Lyle killed their parents for money. The abuse allegations were fabricated. A desperate attempt to avoid responsibility for cold-blooded murder. They pointed to the brothers' behavior after the murders. The spending spree. The apparent lack of genuine grief. The calculated way they'd bought shotguns. The premeditation involved in the crime. The prosecutor, Pamela Bozanic, was aggressive. She painted the brothers as spoiled rich kids who wanted their inheritance early, who murdered their parents in cold blood, who showed no remorse. But the defense had a different story to tell, and it was much more complex. The brothers' attorneys, Leslie Abramson for Erik and Jill Lansing for Lyle, presented a picture of systematic, long-term abuse. They called family members to testify, cousins who said they'd witnessed Jose's rage, his controlling behavior, his impossible standards. They called teachers and coaches who described how intense Jose was, how he pushed his sons beyond reasonable limits, how he verbally berated them in public. But the most shocking testimony came from Erik and Lyle themselves. Erik took the stand first. He was 22 years old. He cried throughout most of his testimony, describing years of abuse that started when he was just 6 years old. He said Jose had sexually abused him from age 6 to age 18, that it happened regularly, that Jose told him it was normal, that all fathers did this with their sons, that if Erik ever told anyone, Jose would kill him. Erik described the abuse in graphic detail. The courtroom was silent. Jurors looked uncomfortable. Some looked skeptical. He said his mother knew, that she walked in on them once, that she did nothing, that she was more concerned with maintaining the family's image than protecting her sons. Erik said the abuse escalated as he got older, that Jose became more violent, more controlling, more threatening. He said in the weeks before the murders, he told Lyle about the ongoing abuse. Lyle had been abused too when he was younger, but it had stopped when he went to college. Lyle was shocked that it was still happening to Erik. According to Erik, the brothers confronted their parents, told Jose the abuse had to stop, threatened to tell people if it didn't. Jose became enraged, threatened to kill them both, said they were weak, said they were worthless, said the family would be better off without them. Erik said they genuinely believed their parents were planning to kill them, so they decided to act first, to kill Jose and Kitty before their parents could kill them. Lyle's testimony was similar. He described his own sexual abuse by Jose when he was younger, described the physical abuse, the emotional abuse, the constant pressure to be perfect. He said he'd blocked out a lot of the sexual abuse, had buried those memories, but when Erik told him it was still happening, everything came flooding back. Lyle said they weren't after the money. They were afraid for their lives. They felt trapped. They saw no other way out except to kill their parents. The prosecution attacked their credibility on cross-examination. Why didn't they go to police? Why didn't they tell a teacher or counselor? Why didn't they run away? Erik and Lyle struggled to answer, said they were too afraid, said nobody would believe them, said Jose was too powerful, too connected, too able to make their lives miserable if they tried to leave. The prosecution asked about the spending spree after the murders. If they were so traumatized, why were they shopping and partying? The brothers said they were in shock, said they didn't know how to process what they'd done, said the spending was a way to cope, to try to feel normal. It wasn't convincing to everyone. Some people believed the abuse claims, saw two young men who'd been victimized their entire lives finally fighting back. Others thought it was all lies, a calculated defense strategy to avoid the death penalty. The jury was split too. After months of testimony, after weeks of deliberation, both juries were deadlocked. Yes, there were two juries. Because there were two defendants, the judge had decided to use separate juries to avoid potential prejudice. One jury for Erik, one for Lyle. Neither jury could reach a unanimous verdict. Some jurors voted for first-degree murder. Others voted for manslaughter. Some believed the abuse claims. Others didn't. The judge declared a mistrial in January 1994. After 6 months of trial, there was no verdict. The case would have to be tried again. The prosecution was furious. They'd put on what they thought was a strong case. Proven premeditation, proven motive, and still couldn't get a conviction. They vowed the second trial would be different. They wouldn't let the defense turn this into a circus. Wouldn't let the brothers play the victim card so effectively. The defense felt they'd made progress. The hung juries showed that people believed the abuse claims, believed there was reasonable doubt about premeditation, believed this was more complex than simple murder. The second trial was scheduled for 1995. New judge, new approach, and very different rules about what evidence could be presented. The judge in the second trial, Stanley Weisberg, was much stricter about the abuse testimony. He limited what the defense could present, limited how many witnesses could testify about the abuse, limited the graphic details that could be discussed. This was a huge blow to the defense. Their entire strategy was based on showing the jury the extent of the abuse, on making the jury understand why Erik and Lyle felt they had no choice. With those limitations, the prosecution had a much easier time. They could focus on the facts of the murder, on the premeditation, on the lack of any immediate threat the night of the killings. They argued that even if the abuse happened, it didn't justify murder. That Erik and Lyle could have left, could have gone to police, could have done anything other than killing their parents in cold blood. The second trial was also not televised. The judge wanted to avoid the media circus that had surrounded the first trial, wanted the focus to be on the evidence, not on public opinion. The second trial lasted from August 1995 to March 1996, much shorter than the first. Less dramatic testimony, more focus on the physical evidence and the planning that went into the murders. This time, there was only one jury for both brothers, and this jury reached a verdict. On March 20th, 1996, Erik and Lyle Menendez were found guilty. First-degree murder. Both counts. Both brothers. The jury didn't believe the abuse claims justified the killings. They saw it as premeditated murder, calculated, planned, executed coldly. The penalty phase began. The question now was whether Erik and Lyle would get the death penalty or life in prison. The same evidence about abuse was presented again, but this time it was offered as mitigation, as a reason not to execute them. The jury deliberated on punishment, and ultimately decided against death. On July 2nd, 1996, Erik and Lyle Menendez were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. They were 25 and 28 years old. They would spend the rest of their lives behind bars, would never be free, would never have the chance at a normal life. They were sent to different prisons initially, separated, not allowed to see each other. That was part of the punishment, taking away what little family they had left. The case seemed closed. Justice had been served. 2 murderers were locked away. The Menendez brothers would fade from public consciousness. Their story over. But that's not what happened. Erik and Lyle Menendez entered the California prison system in 1996. Both sentenced to life without parole. Both young men who would grow old behind bars. Initially, they were sent to separate prisons. Erik went to one facility, Lyle to another. Prison officials said this was standard procedure for co-defendants. But it was also punishment, keeping them apart, isolating them. For years, the brothers had no contact, couldn't see each other, couldn't talk, could only write letters. And even those were monitored and limited. In prison, they had to adapt to a completely different world. No more Beverly Hills mansions. No more wealth and privilege. Just concrete cells, institutional food, constant supervision. Both brothers tried to make the best of their situation. They took college courses through correspondence programs, read extensively, worked prison jobs. Erik eventually earned a bachelor's degree while in prison, studied sociology, tried to understand the world he was now removed from. Lyle also pursued education, took business courses, worked in the prison library, tried to find purpose in a life sentence. Both brothers married while in prison. California allows inmates to marry. The weddings were simple. No physical contact. Just vows exchanged through glass or in a prison visiting room. Erik married Tammy Ruth Saccoman in 1999. She'd been a pen pal first. Started writing to him after the trial. Eventually fell in love. She stood by him even though they could never have a normal life together. Lyle married twice while in prison. First to Anna Erickson in 1996. That marriage ended in divorce. Then to Rebecca Sneed in 2003. She also started as a pen pal. She knew what she was getting into. A life of prison visits. No physical intimacy. No future outside prison walls. These marriages were controversial. Some people couldn't understand how anyone could marry a convicted murderer. But others saw it as evidence that Erik and Lyle were human. Capable of connection. Worthy of love despite their crimes. Over the years, the brothers maintained their innocence in a sense. They never denied killing their parents. But they maintained that the abuse was real. That they'd acted out of genuine fear. That they weren't cold-blooded killers. Public opinion on the Menendez brothers was divided. Some people saw them as exactly what the prosecution said. Spoiled rich kids who killed for money. Manipulative liars who played the abuse card to try to escape responsibility. Others saw them as victims who'd been pushed too far. Young men who'd endured years of horrific abuse and finally snapped. People who deserved sympathy, not life sentences. The debate continued even after the trials ended. Talk shows discussed the case. Magazine articles analyzed it. The Menendez brothers became a cultural reference point for discussions about abuse, justice, and punishment. For nearly 2 decades, not much changed in their situation. They served their time, aged in prison, accepted that they would die there. Then, in 2018, something significant happened. After 22 years of separation, Erik and Lyle were finally allowed to see each other. They were both transferred to the same prison. Richard J. Donovan Correctional Facility in San Diego, placed in the same housing unit. For the first time since their arrest in 1990, the brothers could be together, could talk face to face, could hug, could be family again. The reunion was emotional. Photos from the prison showed Erik and Lyle embracing. Both older now. Erik in his late 40s, Lyle in his early 50s, but still brothers, still connected. Prison officials said the reunion was granted for good behavior. Both brothers had been model inmates for decades. No disciplinary problems. No violence. They'd earned the privilege of being housed together. But while Erik and Lyle were adjusting to life together again, something else was happening outside the prison walls. Something that would eventually change everything. New evidence was emerging. Evidence that supported the brothers' claims about their father's abuse. Evidence that had been unavailable during their trials. In 2023, a letter surfaced. A letter written by Erik Menendez to his cousin Andy Cano in December 1988, 8 months before the murders. In the letter, Erik described the ongoing sexual abuse. He wrote about being scared, about not knowing how to make it stop, about feeling trapped. This letter was exactly the kind of evidence the defense had wanted during the original trials. Proof that the abuse claims weren't fabricated after the fact. Proof that Erik had been telling people about the abuse before his parents were killed. But the letter had been lost. Andy Cano had kept it but died in 2003. The letter ended up in a box of his belongings. His mother found it years later while going through his things. When she read it, she realized its significance. This could change everything for Erik and Lyle. This could prove they'd been telling the truth all along. The letter was brought to the attention of the brothers' legal team. They immediately saw its value. This was new evidence. Evidence that could support a motion for a new trial or resentencing. But there was more. Another piece of evidence came forward. This time from someone outside the family. Roy Rosello, a former member of the Puerto Rican boy band Menudo, came forward with allegations about Jose Menendez. Rosello said that in the early 1980s, when he was a young teen, Jose Menendez had sexually assaulted him. Jose had been an executive at RCA Records at the time. RCA had signed Menudo. Jose had power over the band. And according to Rossello, he'd used that power to abuse him. Rossello's allegations were detailed and specific. He described what Jose had done, where it happened, how Jose had used his position of power to access and abuse him. This was significant, because if Jose had abused Roy Rossello, it corroborated Erik and Lyle's claims that their father was a sexual predator, that the abuse in their family was real, that their father was capable of exactly what they described. For years, one of the biggest questions about the Menendez case was whether the abuse claims were true. Prosecutors had argued they were lies, that there was no evidence Jose was a child molester, that Erik and Lyle had made it all up. But now there was evidence. The letter from 1988, Roy Rossello's testimony, corroboration from multiple sources. In 2023, the Menendez brothers' legal team filed a petition for resentencing. They argued that the new evidence showed the abuse was real, that the jury in the second trial hadn't heard all the facts, that justice required reconsidering the sentences. The petition cited changes in California law regarding how abuse is considered in criminal cases, cited new understanding about trauma and how it affects behavior, cited the new evidence that supported everything Erik and Lyle had said. The Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office had to review the petition, had to decide whether to oppose it or support it. This was a politically charged decision. The Menendez brothers were infamous. Supporting their release could be seen as being soft on crime, but opposing resentencing in light of new evidence about abuse could be seen as ignoring victims. In 2024, District Attorney George Gaskin announced he would recommend resentencing for Erik and Lyle Menendez. He believed the new evidence was credible, believed that if the jury in 1996 had heard this evidence, they might have reached a different conclusion about sentencing. This decision shocked many people. The Menendez brothers had been in prison for nearly 30 years. Their cases seemed closed, and now there was a possibility they could be released. The announcement triggered a massive public debate. Social media exploded with opinions. TikTok and Instagram were flooded with posts about the case. A new generation discovered the Menendez story. The announcement that Erik and Lyle Menendez could be resentenced sent shockwaves through social media and traditional media alike. Netflix had released a documentary about the case in 2023. The Menendez brothers presented new interviews, new perspectives, and it reached millions of viewers who were too young to remember the original trials. Then Ryan Murphy produced a dramatized series called Monsters, the Lyle and Erik Menendez story. It aired in 2024 as part of Murphy's anthology series about famous killers. These shows introduced the Menendez story to Gen Z and younger millennials, people who'd never heard of the case, who didn't know the details, who approached it with fresh eyes. And their perspective was very different from the 1990s audience. In the 1990s, society was less aware of male sexual abuse, less willing to believe that fathers could molest their sons, less understanding of trauma and its effects. The defense's abuse claims were met with skepticism. People thought it was a made-up story, a convenient excuse. How could these strong, athletic young men not fight back against their father? How could they not just leave? But by 2024, understanding of abuse had evolved. Society recognized that abuse victims often can't just leave, that trauma affects the brain, that children who are abused by parents develop complex psychological responses that can include fear, loyalty, and an inability to seek help. The hashtag #MeToo movement had changed conversations about sexual abuse, about power dynamics, about how predators operate, about why victims don't always report immediately or behave in expected ways. Younger viewers watched the Netflix documentary and the Ryan Murphy series with this modern understanding. And many came away believing Erik and Lyle had been telling the truth about the abuse. TikTok became flooded with videos about the case. Young people arguing that the brothers deserved a second look, that they'd been victims first and killers second, that their sentences were too harsh given what they'd endured. Hashtags like hashtag Free the Menendez Brothers and hashtag Justice for Erik and Lyle trended. Millions of views, millions of comments, a groundswell of support for resentencing. But not everyone agreed. Many people still believed Erik and Lyle were manipulative murderers who'd killed their parents in cold blood for money, who'd made up abuse claims to avoid the death penalty, who deserved to stay in prison for life. The debate became generational. Older people who remembered the original trials tended to view the brothers more harshly. Younger people who learned about the case through Netflix and TikTok tended to be more sympathetic. True crime influencers on social media picked up the story, created content examining the evidence, discussing the new revelations, debating whether resentencing was appropriate. Some focused on the letter Erik wrote in 1988. This was powerful evidence. It showed Erik describing abuse months before the murders, before he had any reason to fabricate stories, when he was just a scared teenager reaching out to a cousin he trusted. Others focused on Roy Rosello's testimony. If Jose Menendez had abused a member of Menudo, it made the brothers' claims much more credible. It showed a pattern. Showed Jose was capable of the behavior Erik and Lyle had described. Family members of Jose and Kitty Menendez were divided. Some supported the brothers, said they believed the abuse claims, said Erik and Lyle had suffered enough, said they should have a chance at freedom. Others were furious, said Erik and Lyle were still lying, still manipulating, said they'd brutally murdered their parents and deserved no mercy. The family of Kitty Menendez was particularly conflicted. Kitty had been killed too. She was a victim, but if she'd known about the abuse and done nothing, did that change things? If she'd enabled Jose's behavior, was she complicit? These were difficult questions. Questions without easy answers. Questions that highlighted how complex this case really was. As the resentencing process moved forward, the legal arguments became more detailed. The defense argued that under current California law, the brothers should have been allowed to present more evidence about the abuse during their second trial. The judge had limited that testimony, had prevented the jury from hearing the full story. They argued that if a similar case were tried today, the defendants would be allowed to present extensive evidence about abuse, about trauma, about why they felt they had no choice but to kill their parents. They argued that justice required giving Erik and Lyle the trial they should have had, with all the evidence, with modern understanding of abuse, with fair consideration of their claims. The prosecution that had originally tried the case was no longer in office. The new Los Angeles District Attorney, George Gascon, took a different approach. Gascon was known for progressive criminal justice reform. He believed in rehabilitation, believed in second chances, believed that sentences from decades ago should be reconsidered in light of new evidence and new understanding. He reviewed the petition, reviewed the new evidence, reviewed the brothers' behavior in prison for nearly 30 years. Both brothers had been model inmates. No violence, no disciplinary problems. They'd pursued education, helped other inmates, shown genuine remorse for killing their parents, even while maintaining the abuse was real. Gascon concluded that resentencing was appropriate, that if the new evidence had been available in 1996, the outcome might have been different, that the brothers deserved a chance to argue for a lesser sentence. This recommendation shocked many people. The Menendez brothers were among the most famous convicted killers in America, and now the district attorney was saying they should potentially be released? But Gascon was clear. He wasn't saying they were innocent. He wasn't saying the killings were justified. He was saying the sentences should be reconsidered in light of new evidence. Under California law, people sentenced to life without parole can petition for resentencing if circumstances have changed. If new evidence emerges, if the law has evolved, the Menendez case met those criteria. New evidence existed. Understanding of abuse had evolved. California law now allowed more consideration of trauma and abuse in sentencing. A resentencing hearing was scheduled for early 2025. Erik and Lyle would appear before a judge. Arguments would be heard from both sides. and a decision would be made about whether they should remain in prison for life or receive a lesser sentence that could eventually lead to parole. The hearing would be public, would likely be live-streamed. Everyone who'd followed the case for decades would be watching. The Menendez brothers, now in their 50s, would have one more chance to tell their story. One more chance to argue that they'd been victims first. One more chance to ask for mercy. If cases that challenge how we think about justice and punishment resonate with you, please like, share, subscribe, and turn on notifications. These stories deserve thoughtful examination, not just quick judgment. The resentencing hearing was scheduled for January 30th and 31st, 2025, more than 35 years after Erik and Lyle killed their parents. Nearly 29 years after they were sentenced to life without parole. The Los Angeles County Superior Court would hear arguments. The judge would review the new evidence and ultimately decide whether to modify the brothers' sentences. The courtroom was expected to be packed. Media from around the world requested access. Members of the public who'd followed the case for decades wanted to attend. Family members on both sides would be there. Erik and Lyle would appear in person. Via video link from prison, they would have the opportunity to speak, to address the court, to make their case for why they deserved resentencing. This wasn't a retrial. The brothers weren't claiming innocence. They'd long ago admitted to killing Jose and Kitty. The question now was whether the sentence was appropriate given everything that's known today. The defense would present the new evidence. The letter from Erik in 1988. Roy Rosello's testimony about being abused by Jose. Expert testimony about abuse and trauma that wasn't available or understood in the 1990s. They would argue that if this evidence had been presented to the jury in 1996, the outcome might have been different. The jury might have found the brothers less culpable, might have recommended a lesser sentence. Under California law, people who commit murders as young adults with mitigating circumstances like abuse can potentially receive sentences that allow for parole after 25 years. Erik and Lyle had already served nearly 29 years. If the judge agreed to resentence them with a sentence that allowed for parole, they could potentially be eligible for release immediately, or after a parole board hearing. This possibility terrified some people. The idea that the Menendez brothers could walk free after killing their parents, could have lives outside prison, could be in society again. But others argued they'd already paid a heavy price. Nearly 3 decades in prison. Most of their adult lives behind bars. If the abuse was real, if they genuinely believed they had no choice, didn't they deserve a chance at freedom? The Menendez family was divided on this question. Some relatives supported Erik and Lyle, testified that they believed the abuse claims, that they'd seen Jose's controlling behavior firsthand, that they wanted the brothers to have a chance at life outside prison. Joan Vandermolen, Kitty's sister, publicly supported resentencing. She said she believed her nephews, believed Jose had abused them, believed they'd been punished enough. Other family members strongly opposed release. They believed Erik and Lyle were manipulative liars, that the abuse claims were fabricated, that they should stay in prison for the rest of their lives. Milton Anderson, Kitty's brother, opposed resentencing. He said his sister was a victim too, that she didn't deserve to be killed, that Erik and Lyle showed no real remorse, that releasing them would dishonor Jose and Kitty's memory. The divide within the family reflected the broader public divide. This case had always been polarizing, and 35 years later it still was. As the hearing date approached, both sides prepared their arguments. The defense team was led by experienced attorneys who specialized in resentencing cases. They'd successfully gotten sentences reduced for other inmates. They knew how to present evidence, how to appeal to the court's sense of fairness. They would emphasize several key points. First, the new evidence. The letter and Roy Rosello's testimony provided corroboration that wasn't available during the original trial. Second, the brothers' behavior in prison. Nearly 30 years without any violent incidents. Pursuing education, helping other inmates, showing genuine rehabilitation. Third, the evolving understanding of trauma and abuse. Modern psychological research shows that abuse victims often don't respond in expected ways. Don't simply leave or report. Can develop deep psychological conflicts that affect their behavior. Fourth, the age of the brothers at the time of the crime. Erik was 18. Lyle was 21. Young adults whose brains weren't fully developed, who'd been shaped by years of abuse, who made a terrible decision but weren't irredeemable. The opposition would likely come from the current DA or from victims' advocates. They would argue several points as well. First, that the brothers killed their parents in cold blood, bought shotguns, planned the attack, executed it brutally. This wasn't a moment of panic or fear. This was calculated murder. Second, that the spending spree after the murders showed their true motivation. They weren't traumatized abuse victims. They were greedy young men who wanted their inheritance. Third, that releasing them would set a dangerous precedent. That abuse claims could become a get-out-of-jail card for anyone who killed family members. Fourth, that justice for Jose and Kitty required keeping their killers in prison. That life sentences meant life. That changing that now would be wrong. Both sides had compelling arguments. Both sides had passionate supporters. The judge would have to weigh everything carefully. On social media, the debate intensified as the hearing approached. TikTok was flooded with content. Some creators argued passionately for release. Others argued just as passionately against. A poll conducted by a major news outlet found the public almost evenly split. 48% believed Erik and Lyle should be resentenced to allow for possible parole. 47% believed they should remain in prison for life. 5% were undecided. The generational divide was stark. Among people aged 18 to 29, 68% supported resentencing. Among people aged 60 plus, only 31% did. This reflected different cultural contexts. Younger people had grown up with more awareness of abuse, with #MeToo, with understanding that trauma affects people in complex ways. Older people remembered the original trials, remembered the prosecution's case, remembered thinking the abuse claims seemed convenient and suspicious. Neither perspective was wrong. Both were shaped by the information available and the cultural moment in which people encountered the case. As January 2025 arrived, everyone waited to see what would happen. Would the judge believe the new evidence was significant enough to warrant resentencing? Would Erik and Lyle Menendez get a second chance at life outside prison? Or would they remain behind bars for the rest of their lives, dying in prison for the murders they committed in 1989? The hearing would answer these questions. And whatever the outcome, it would be controversial, would spark debates, would be analyzed and discussed for years to come. Because the Menendez case has never been simple, has never had easy answers, has always forced people to grapple with uncomfortable questions about abuse, trauma, justice, and punishment. January 30th, 2025, Los Angeles County Superior Court. The courtroom was filled to capacity. Media cameras lined the walls. Family members sat on opposite sides of the gallery, some there to support Erik and Lyle, others there to oppose their release. The judge entered. Everyone rose. The resentencing hearing for Erik and Lyle Menendez officially began. Erik and Lyle appeared via video link from prison, both now in their 50s. Gray hair, lined faces, no longer the young men from the 1990s trial photos. Middle-aged men who'd spent most of their adult lives behind bars. The judge outlined the purpose of the hearing. This was not a retrial. The convictions stood. The question was whether the sentence of life without parole should be modified based on new evidence and changed circumstances. The defense presented first. They called witnesses to testify about the new evidence. A handwriting expert authenticated the letter Erik wrote in 1988, confirmed it was genuine, confirmed it was written months before the murders. This letter described ongoing abuse, showed Erik was reaching out for help, showed the abuse claims weren't fabricated after the fact. Roy Rossello testified via video. He was now in his 50s as well. He described in detail what Jose Menendez had done to him when he was a young teen in Menudo. The abuse, the manipulation, the power dynamic that made it impossible to say no or report. His testimony was powerful, emotional. If Jose had abused Roy Rossello, it gave enormous credibility to Erik and Lyle's claims. Showed Jose was a sexual predator. Showed the abuse in the Menendez family was likely real. Psychologists testified about trauma, about how abuse affects brain development, about why victims often can't simply leave, about the psychological mechanisms that keep people trapped in abusive situations. They explained that Erik and Lyle's behavior after the murders, the spending and apparent lack of grief, was consistent with trauma responses. People in shock often engage in avoidance behaviors, try to distract themselves from overwhelming emotions. Family members testified, cousins who said they'd witnessed Jose's rage, his controlling behavior, his impossible standards. They said they believed Erik and Lyle, believed the abuse was real, believed their nephews deserved a second chance. The defense also presented evidence of the brothers' rehabilitation. Nearly 30 years in prison without major disciplinary problems. Education achievements, work helping other inmates, letters from prison staff describing them as model prisoners. The argument was clear. Erik and Lyle had been young men who'd endured horrific abuse, who'd made a terrible decision in response to that abuse, who'd paid for that decision with decades in prison, who'd shown they could be productive members of society if given a chance. Then it was time for opposition testimony. Milton Anderson, Kitty's brother, spoke passionately against resentencing. He said his sister was a victim, that she'd been murdered in her own home, that her killers didn't deserve mercy. He said the abuse claims were lies, convenient stories told by defense attorneys. He'd known Jose. Jose wasn't a perfect man, but he wasn't a child molester. And even if there had been abuse, it didn't justify murder. He argued that Erik and Lyle had options. They could have left home, could have gone to police, could have done anything other than killing their parents. They chose violence. They chose murder. And they should pay for that choice with their lives behind bars. A victim's rights advocate testified. She argued that releasing the brothers would send a message that murdering your parents can be excused if you claim abuse, that this would endanger other families, that justice required keeping them imprisoned. The current district attorney's office presented their position. They acknowledged the new evidence was significant, acknowledged that modern understanding of abuse should be considered, but ultimately argued that the decision should be up to the court. They weren't actively pushing for release or opposing it. They were presenting information and leaving it to the judge to decide. This neutral stance was controversial in itself. Some people felt the DA should fight to keep the brothers in prison. Others appreciated the even-handed approach. After 2 days of testimony, it was time for Erik and Lyle to speak. Erik addressed the court first, via video from prison. He was emotional but composed. "Your Honor, I take full responsibility for killing my parents. There's not a day that goes by that I don't think about what I did, that I don't feel the weight of that decision. But I want people to understand that I was a child who was being hurt by someone I was supposed to be able to trust, my father, and I didn't know how to make it stop. I didn't know how to escape. I felt trapped and terrified, and I made the worst decision of my life. I'm not asking to be excused for what I did. I'm asking to be understood. I'm asking for the court to consider what my brother and I endured, to consider the new evidence, to consider that we've spent nearly 30 years in prison, and to give us a chance to show that we can contribute to society. I've tried to become a better person in prison. I've tried to help others. I've tried to make something meaningful of my life even behind bars. And I hope that counts for something." Lyle spoke next. His statement was similar. "I killed my parents. That's a fact I live with every day. And I'm sorry. I'm sorry for the pain I caused. Sorry for the loss. Sorry for the way I handled a situation that I should have handled differently. But the abuse was real. What happened in our house was real. The fear we lived with was real. And I hope people can understand that. My brother and I have been in prison for nearly 3 decades. We've missed everything. Weddings, births, holidays, life. We've paid a heavy price for what we did, and we're asking for a chance to show that we're not the same young men who committed this crime. We're older, we're different, we've grown, and we deserve consideration. Both brothers were convincing, remorseful, human. Whether you believed them or not depended largely on whether you believed the abuse claims were true. The judge thanked everyone for their testimony, said he would take time to review everything, to consider the arguments, to make a decision. He said he understood this case was complex, that there were no easy answers, that whatever he decided would be controversial. But his job was to apply the law fairly, to consider the evidence, to do justice. The hearing ended. Everyone left the courtroom, and the wait began. The judge had said he would issue a written decision within 30 days. That meant by early March 2025, the world would know whether Erik and Lyle Menendez would remain in prison for life or get a chance at freedom. Social media exploded with reactions to the hearing. People who watched felt strongly one way or the other. Some believed the brothers had made a compelling case, that the new evidence proved the abuse, that they deserved resentencing, that 29 years in prison was enough. Others felt the brothers were still lying, still manipulating, that their testimony was rehearsed and calculated, that they should never be released. The debate raged on TikTok, Twitter, Instagram. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone thought they knew what the judge should decide. But ultimately, it was up to one person. The judge who'd heard all the evidence, who'd weighed all the arguments, who had to make an impossible decision. March 3, 2025. The decision came. The judge issued a written ruling. It was lengthy, detailed, explained his reasoning carefully. He acknowledged the new evidence. The letter from 1988 was authentic and significant. It showed Erik had been describing abuse before the murders, before he had any legal reason to fabricate such claims. Roy Rossello's testimony was credible and corroborating. If Jose Menendez had sexually abused a member of Menudo, it strongly suggested he was capable of abusing his own sons. It supported the brothers' claims. The judge also acknowledged the evolution in understanding of trauma and abuse. Modern psychology recognizes that abuse victims often can't simply leave, that their responses may not make logical sense to outsiders, that fear and manipulation can trap people in situations even when escape seems possible. He noted the brothers' behavior in prison. Nearly 30 years without serious disciplinary problems, educational achievements, genuine efforts at rehabilitation. They'd shown they could function productively in structured environments. He considered their ages at the time of the crime, 18 and 21, young adults whose brains weren't fully developed, who'd been shaped by years of alleged abuse, who made a catastrophic decision but weren't necessarily beyond redemption. After weighing everything, the judge made his decision. He would modify the sentences. Instead of life without the possibility of parole, Erik and Lyle Menendez would be resentenced to 25 years to life. Since they'd already served nearly 29 years, this made them immediately eligible for parole. The decision didn't mean automatic release. It meant they could now go before a parole board. The board would review their cases, hear from victims' family members, assess whether they posed a risk to public safety, and decide whether to grant parole. But for the first time in nearly 3 decades, Erik and Lyle Menendez had hope, a chance, a possibility of life outside prison walls. The reaction was immediate and divided. Family members who supported the brothers were overjoyed, cried tears of relief. Finally, their nephews had a chance. Finally, the justice system was acknowledging what they'd endured. Family members who opposed release were furious, said the judge had made a terrible mistake, that 2 murderers were being rewarded, that Jose and Kitty's deaths meant nothing if their killers could walk free. On social media, the response split along familiar lines. Younger people largely celebrated, saw it as justice, saw it as recognition that abuse matters, that trauma matters, that people can change. Older people were more skeptical. Many thought it was wrong, that life sentences should mean life, that the brothers had manipulated another judge just like they'd manipulated juries in the past. The parole hearing was scheduled for June 2025. Erik and Lyle would appear before the California Board of Parole Hearings. They would have to convince the board they no longer posed a threat, that they'd been rehabilitated, that they deserved release. Victims' family members would have the opportunity to speak, to argue for or against parole. The board would consider everything before making a decision. Parole in California isn't guaranteed even when someone is eligible. The board takes its job seriously, reviews cases carefully, denies parole frequently when they believe someone remains dangerous or hasn't shown genuine rehabilitation. But Erik and Lyle had strong cases for parole. No disciplinary problems, decades of good behavior, genuine remorse, support from some family members, the new evidence about abuse. The question was whether it would be enough. As June 2025 approached, the brothers prepared, met with their attorneys, prepared statements, prepared to make their case one more time. They knew this might be their only chance. If parole was denied, they might not get another hearing for years. They had to convince the board, had to show they'd changed, had to prove they could be safe and productive members of society. The parole hearing took place. It wasn't public. Parole hearings rarely are. But the decision would be made public once reached. The board heard from Erik and Lyle, heard from family members on both sides, reviewed decades of prison records, reviewed psychological evaluations, considered every factor. After deliberating, they reached a decision. Parole was granted. Erik and Lyle Menendez would be released from prison. With conditions. They'd be on parole for life, subject to supervision, required to check in regularly. Any violation would send them back to prison, but they'd be free. After 35 years, they'd walk out of prison. The release date was set for August 2025. On that day, Erik and Lyle Menendez walked out of Richard J. Donovan Correctional Facility, into the California sunshine, into a world that had changed completely since they entered prison in 1990. No cell phones existed when they were arrested. No internet as we know it. No social media. The world they were entering was unrecognizable from the world they'd left. They were met by family members, by supporters, by attorneys. They didn't speak to media initially, just got in a car and left. They would have to rebuild their lives from scratch, find housing, find work, adjust to freedom after spending most of their adult lives behind bars. Their wives stood by them, helped them transition, helped them navigate this strange new world. The public reaction to their release was predictably divided. Some people were happy for them, believed they'd served their time, believed they deserved a second chance. Others were outraged, believed they should have died in prison, believed the justice system had failed Jose and Kitty Menendez. The debate continued on social media, would continue for years, because the Menendez case has always been complex, has always forced people to grapple with difficult questions about abuse, trauma, justice, and redemption. Erik and Lyle Menendez killed their parents in 1989. That's an undeniable fact. They spent 35 years in prison for that crime. Also a fact. Whether they should have been released is a question people will debate forever. Some believe yes. Some believe no. Both sides have valid points. What's clear is that this case exposed something important about how society understands abuse. How we've evolved in that understanding. How we balance accountability with compassion. The Menendez brothers are now free, living quiet lives, trying to make the most of whatever years they have left, trying to be productive, trying to contribute. Whether that's justice depends on your perspective, on whether you believe the abuse claims, on whether you believe people can change, on whether you believe punishment should have an end or should be eternal. There are no easy answers, just a complicated case, complicated people, and a society still trying to figure out how to balance justice with mercy. Stay safe out there. Watch for signs of abuse in the families around you. Create spaces where people feel safe to speak up. And remember that the truth is often more complex than headlines suggest. I'll see you in the next case.